Chapter 16. Ambush at Dusk. Virginia shook uncontrollably as her eyes darted back and forth at the 5 wolves surrounding her and Tristan. They all leered at her with thirstful eyes. Saliva dripped from their sharp teeth. They growled, barked, and taunted as they circled them like sharks closing in on their prey. "Virginia," Tristan said calmly, "could you do me a favor?" Virginia's eyes darted to and from the growling wolves circling them. What? There was a small ram's horn in the satchel at our feet. "Kindly get that for us, would you?" Virginia knelt down and blindly trailed her hands across the dirt while never taking her eyes off the monsters around them. She felt the satchel and gasped. A wolf darted at her. Virginia screamed. Tristan turned and pointed his sword at the oncoming wolf. Instantly it halted, barked at them, and pulled back. Tristan quickly turned around and looked behind him, turning his head at each of the animals. "Have you found it yet?" Virginia slipped her hand inside the flap and maneuvered her hands through unknown objects until she finally found it. "Yes," she replied. "Good. Now stand up and sound the alarm with it." "Do what?" "Sound the alarm. Alert the others." Virginia licked her lips and blew into the ram's horn. No trumpeting sound blasted, only the wispy chirp of dry air. She tried again, but only the same repeated. "It's not working," she cried. She felt her nerves and stress rise at the sound of Tristan laughing. "I'm sorry," he teased. She stared at him confusedly out of the corner of her eye. "What?" "I couldn't resist," he laughed. "No one could do that right the first time. I figured you never played a trumpet before, so I had you attempt it." She looked back and forth between the guy she wanted to slap and the wolves that hoped to devour her. "Tristan!" "Here," he giggled. "Give it here. I'll do it." He reached behind and snagged the horn out of her hands. Placing it to his lips, he gave a loud blast. The wolves around them lowered their ears and whimpered in pain at the call of the trumpet. He passed it back to her. "Here, try it again." She frustratingly tossed it down. "No!" "I'm sorry," giggled Tristan. "I couldn't help myself. Okay, I'm all done now. Seriously, no more." Virginia spoke through her gnashing teeth. "How can you be so calm now? As much darkness as I've fought over the years, you can either allow it to make you crazy or you can laugh at it." Virginia grabbed the side of his cloak and held firmly onto him while keeping her eyes focused on the 2 wolves in front of her. "What now?" Tristan turned his head back and forth between the wolves when something above caught his eye. "Close your eyes." Virginia turned her head slightly. "What?" "Do it now," shouted Tristan. She saw it briefly. A massive hammer flew through the air in their direction. She watched as it twirled like a tomahawk before its head smote the ground beside one of the wolves. She felt the ground thud beneath her feet and watched as a wave of dirt exploded in every direction. She closed her eyes and turned her head as the shattered earth crashed into them and everything nearby. She heard wolves whining, whimpering in pain. She opened her eyes, only to find a wolf's snout almost touching her nose. She screamed as the beast pried open its jaws large enough to engulf her entire head. A roaring battle cry thundered overhead. Virginia and the wolf looked up and saw Nathaniel falling toward them. In his hands was his shimmering sword, lifted high above his head. The wolf tried to flee but managed to scramble only a few feet away before Nathaniel fell in front of him and brought his sword down upon the creature with a mighty swing and a thunderous clap. Virginia watched as the wolf's head slipped off its shoulders and toppled to the ground, along with the rest of its twitching corpse. She turned her head away at the gross sight and forced herself to refocus on all around her. The remaining wolves retreated into the shadows of the woods, staying a good 100 yards back, but their defeat was far from their minds. Like speedy phantoms, they raced in and out of the shadowy depths of the forest, falling in and out of sight within the distant shadows. Virginia's heart raced faster, and her breathing panicked. One minute she saw a shadow swiftly move out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned her head to spot it, nothing was there. Suddenly another shadow flew through the trees beside her, but once again nothing was found. Only the haunting, ghostly echoes of wolf cries could be discerned from the darkness. Nathaniel twirled his sword around and looked this way and that at the passing shadows. "I can hardly see them. Tristan, can you?" "Yeah, I can see them," said Tristan, holding his guard. "They're going to try to charge us. In a coordinated effort, one will strike from one side, while another strikes right after it, from another angle." She swallowed a breath, trying to calm down as best as possible. "You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay." The call of a mighty hawk echoed above. Virginia lifted her eyes and saw the dove squawking loudly. "How can a dove make that sound?" she asked. "What's he calling for?" Tristan looked up. The trees! Virginia looked up where his gaze was focused. Her body froze. She had less than 3 seconds to react. A dark shadow leaped from tree to tree in the distance. She looked up just in time to see it sink its claws into the final one before leaping down in their direction. She drew what she thought was her last breath. A loud battle cry of an eagle shouted from behind. A white comet of light fell out of the sky and smote the oncoming wolf. Virginia covered her ears as a loud clap of thunder exploded no more than 20 feet above her head. She squinted and watched as the white comet smashed the wolf into the ground. She rubbed her eyes and saw Charles standing on the monster, pulling his shining sword out of its ribs. With a clap of his wings, he did a backflip in the air and landed beside him. Spreading his wings in front of him like a shield, he glared into the forest. "How many?" yelled Charles. "How many?" "Right," began Tristan. "So far, 8 confirmed, 5 dead, 3 remaining. Are there more?" "We don't know." "Tristan, do you see them?" asked Charles. Tristan kept turning his head in multiple directions. "Yes, I can see them. Well, at least the 2 in front of me, in the distance. Virginia?" Virginia shivered in her stance while darting her eyes all around her. "You're going to ask me to pick up something for you again, aren't you?" "Yes, please, my bow and quiver, if you will." She groaned and whimpered, but forced her eyes to fall away from her surroundings and focus on the ground. She spotted them resting a few feet away. Carefully, she reached out of her protection zone, reeled in Tristan's bow and quiver, and stood up again, tightly holding onto them in her quivering arms. "Okay," she panted. "I got them." "Lovely," replied Tristan. "Now kindly take an arrow out of the quiver, attach it to the bowstring, and pass it to me." Virginia slung the quiver over her shoulder like a purse. She drew an arrow out and with shaking hands attached it to the bowstring. "Okay, it's ready," she said. "Excellent," he replied, passing the hilt of his sword to her. "Now swap with me." Virginia took the handle of his sword and placed the bow and the quiver's sleeve in Tristan's hands. "Do you have a plan, Tristan?" asked Nathaniel. Tristan slipped his quiver over his shoulder and readied his bow. "I do." "Nathaniel, you cover me. Soaring Eagle, we're going to do fish in a barrel, but treetop edition." "You sure?" asked Nathaniel. "Unless you gents have a better idea," questioned Tristan. "That's all I can think of." "Wait," interrupted Virginia. "What's fish in a barrel with treetops?" "Okay, I'm game," said Charles. "Let's do this." "Good," exclaimed Tristan. "Nathaniel, cover me." "Guys," exclaimed Virginia, "talk to me. What's fish in a barrel?" "The name is misleading," said Tristan. "More like bait in a fish barrel." Her eyes grew wider. "What do you mean, bait?" At that moment, Charles spun around, wrapped his arm around her, and pulled her close. With a clap of his wings, they shot off into the treetops. "Charles, what are you doing?" she screamed. "Trust us," he replied. She felt her feet land on a barky flooring. She looked down and saw that they were standing on the branch of a red pine. She held onto Charles with both hands as the ground below her grew further and further away. She closed her eyes and buried her face in his chest. "Oh no, oh no, this is high, this is very, very high." "You're okay," said Charles calmly. "I've got you." She pulled her head back and looked up at him as if she had solved a math problem. She pointed to herself. "Bait," she said. "I'm the bait. Is that what this is?" "Well, they're after you no matter what, but this way." Charles was interrupted by Virginia's hand smacking the back of his head. "Ow!" he moaned. "What was that for?" "For using me as bait," she shouted. "Oh, come on, it's not like we left you in an open, exposed field. I would never abandon you like that." She looked into his eyes, and for a brief moment, all her fear dissolved. She felt his strong arm holding her close and the warmth of his wings surrounding her. She smiled at him. "Okay, then." He smiled back. She smacked the back of his head again. "Hey!" he groaned. "What was that for?" "That one was for Tristan," she said. "Well, why don't you slap him then?" "'Cause his head is way down there." "Incoming!" shouted Tristan below. Charles looked around them. Virginia wrapped one arm around him and gripped Tristan's sword in her other shaking hand. Their eyes darted in every direction, scanning all corners of the tree canopy. "Where is it?" shouted Charles. Virginia's heart stopped at a shadow leaping in their direction. "Charles!" Charles turned his eyes. Quickly, he clapped his wings and shot them off like a dart to another tree. Virginia looked behind them, spotting a wolf landing on a branch, where they were just standing. Without breaking a stride, it jumped after them, falling in Charles's wake. Virginia heard a faint whistle sound gliding in their direction. A second later, an arrow plunged deep into the wolf's side. The creature barked and whimpered. Losing its balance, it fell below and crashed into the ground. Charles twirled his sword around and stabbed it into the side of the tree. Pulling Virginia more in front of him, he wrapped his wings around the tree's body, holding them close to its bark with a shield of feathers covering their sides. Virginia rested her head on his chest. She looked at his swelling arm as it held onto his sword anchored into the tree. His toes pressed firmly against the bark while his other arm still held her close. She looked down for a second before recoiling her face from staring at the ground. "Still too high," she whispered nervously. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady pounding of his strong heart. Her breath soon began to inhale and exhale in unison with his. Her trembling body slowly began to calm. "You're safe," he said warmly. She nodded her head against his chest. "That's one," shouted Tristan from below. She heard Nathaniel yell loudly, followed by a clap of thunder. "How did you miss him?" shouted Tristan. "He ran back," shouted Nathaniel. "I'm not going to chase after him." Virginia smiled and shook her head at their nonsense. "One charged at the two of them, and Nathaniel missed it, right?" She melted into him as he laughed deeply. "Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So this is a normal day for you guys, huh?" Charles waited a moment before replying. "Well, I don't hold Tristan in my arms like you, if that's what you're wondering." She smiled and laughed into his chest. "Charles!" shouted Tristan. "Two coming your way!" Charles unfolded his wings and looked around them. High above were two wolves heading in their direction on either side. "Ready?" he asked. She held onto him tightly and braced her feet against the tree. "Yes." Charles pulled his sword out of the red pine and shot off to another tree across from them. Virginia looked behind her and watched as the two wolves slowly fell towards them over multiple branches. Charles darted from tree to tree, landing on one and pushing off to another. The wolves followed close behind. Virginia watched with uneased nerves as they drew closer and closer. Soon Charles would land on a tree and leap off, only to have the wolves land right where they were a second later. She held onto him tightly and began to shiver in fear. "Charles, they're gaining on us." A faint whistle sounded below. She watched as one of the wolves crashed to the ground with an arrow in its chest. Charles leaped onto one tree and then darted toward the ground. Virginia looked up and saw they were heading in Tristan and Nathaniel's direction. She turned her head around and saw the wolf make his mistake. It landed on the tree they were just on, and without thinking pounced toward the ground after them. Charles spread his wings and glided over Tristan and Nathaniel. As Charles and Virginia cleared out of the way, Tristan pointed his arrow at the wolf leaping in his direction. "Bullseye!" He released the arrow. It whistled through the air and sank deeply into the monster's right eye. It fell lifelessly to the ground and crashed in front of Tristan's feet. Charles spread his wings wide like a sail, dragged to a slow stop, and softly landed on the ground. He held Virginia tightly while shielding her with one of his wings. She looked over the edge of his wing at Tristan and Nathaniel and the scattered wolf corpses. "Is it over?" she asked. Charles tried to calm his breathing while looking all around them. "I don't know." A deep, rasping laugh bellowed beside them. All four of them looked at a wolf lying on the ground, with an arrow protruding from its side. It rested with contorted, broken limbs and choked on blood spilling out of its mouth. Yet it laughed, with a pleased and deranged smile. Tristan chambered another arrow and aimed it at the creature as he and Nathaniel approached. Nathaniel grabbed his hammer, resting on the ground, and pushed it against the laughing wolf. "What's got you in such a good mood on your deathbed?" It stared up at him with its haunting green eyes. "Your confidence is high now, isn't it?" "That typically happens after winning a fight." The beast coughed black blood on the ground. "Enjoy it. This was just a skirmish, a small attack. Yeah, I put that together myself, considering there were only 8 of you this time, but many more of you earlier this morning. Go ahead and choke on your laughter. You attacked us both with many and with few. We bested you on both occasions. If you attack us again, we will only best you again." The wolf laughed. "You won't be fighting just us next time. We have something far more powerful coming down the pipe for you all." It lifted its head and stared at Virginia. "Just wait. Cohen will be dead by the end of tomorrow, and you 3 will watch as she falls before your eyes." Nathaniel lifted his hammer high, preparing to bring it down on the devil, but froze his attack, watching as the creature's chest fell one final time, breathing his last. Nathaniel lowered the head of his hammer to the ground and stared at the dead wolf. Tristan slowly slid his arrow down and lowered his bow. Virginia looked into the lifeless eyes of the phantom. As it continued to stare at her, she shivered as his words echoed in her mind. "Don't worry," said Charles. She looked up into his eyes. "You're going to be okay," he said. She looked one final time into the eyes of the wolf before hiding her eyes behind Charles's wing. Virginia stood on the path's edge, staring over the Great Canyon, at the sun falling behind the distant mountains. Behind her, she could hear Charles, Tristan, and Nathaniel setting up camp, but she was far removed from their conversations while their actions became ambiguous background noise. She wrapped her cloak closely around her and shivered. The light canyon breeze danced her hair in front of her glistening eyes. She drew deep breaths through her nose, doing everything she could to keep herself calm. She heard footsteps approaching her from behind. "Hey," said Charles. "You okay?" She shook her head. She could feel his strong presence standing behind her. She closed her eyes and wanted to fall back into him. "What's on your mind?" he asked. She opened her eyes and looked back at the sunset. "It's the last sliver." "Of the sunset, you mean?" She nodded her head. "The darkest of deeds always take place in the shadows, and the night is the darkest of shadows." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I don't know why I'm so worried about it. After all, they seem not to care what time of day they attack, whether it be the morning before dawn or in the late afternoon under broad daylight. They seem to be bold, these wolves, as if they don't care who sees their misdeeds." "They don't care who sees," said Charles. "They want control over this kingdom, and the actions you see now are allowed under the laws they will implement." She closed her eyes again. "How can you say all that and be so calm? How can you look at such horrific monsters day in and day out and not let it affect you?" She felt him step closer to her. "Because I'm on a mission to change it all, and according to the prophecy, it will change for the better. But first we must stand this season of darkness. Just like how the night only lasts for a season, so too does this darkness. Though it might be long and difficult like all seasons, their time will come to an end and give way to the dawning light." She looked down and saw his arm resting at his side. She grabbed his hand and wrapped his arm across her chest. She grabbed his other arm and did the same. She closed her eyes and melted into his embrace as he tightened his arms around her and held her close. She rested her head against his chest as the last ounce of sunlight splashed warmly across her face. "Promise me you won't let them touch me," she whispered. He lowered his lips down to her ear and whispered, "Even if it demands my last breath, I promise." She smiled and sank her head deeper into him. "When do I get to hear your story?" "Can you give me a few more days?" She opened her eyes and watched as the last sliver of light fell out of sight. "Yes." She stayed in his arms until the first few stars could be seen in the night sky. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded her head. "Yeah, I am a little, actually." He pulled his arms back, pressed his hand on her shoulder, and guided her to walk beside him. "Fighting werewolves works up an appetite." She smiled at him. Walking back to camp, she saw Nathaniel and Tristan arranging logs atop a small fire they had built. "Welcome back, Your Highness," said Nathaniel. "If you're hungry, we have some dates, nuts, flatbread, and some of Tristan's famous venison jerky." "The best in all of Lathia," boasted Tristan. Virginia smiled. "Thank you. Maybe in a minute. First, I'd like to thank you all for what you did for me out there and for earlier this morning. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you three." Tristan stood up and walked over to the rickshaw. "Our pleasure." "Any time," said Nathaniel. "Always," said Charles. Tristan opened a satchel hanging on the side of the rickshaw and pulled out a small bag. He walked over to Virginia, opened it, and handed it to her. "Here, try some," he said. "You must be starving." She smiled at him, pulled out some jerky, and took a bite. "Wow, this is really good. This bag is mine, right?" Tristan smiled. "That and more over there if you're still hungry." She swallowed her bite and looked at them. "One thing you'll know about me as we go on, I'm sure, is that I like to have at least a sketch plan of what we're doing next. Would you guys mind telling me the plan of action here?" Nathaniel pointed to the mountain. "We'll leave the rickshaw here and then climb the mountain to the bridge of the Great Canyon." Virginia stared up at the towering mountain. "Okay. After we've crossed that, it's about a 2-day journey to the city of Gaal," said Tristan. She looked down at them. "And this bridge we will be crossing, have these wolf monsters ever tried to cross it before?" "We've never seen nor heard of any doing so," said Nathaniel. "They don't like to venture into that side of the canyon. They're more powerful on this side." "So, like, they can't use their power or anything once they are on that side?" asked Virginia. "Oh, no," said Tristan. "They definitely can, and they are still very powerful, but for reasons that are somewhat spiritual, they're not as powerful as they could be on that side of the bridge. They'll have to put in much more of an effort if they cross over, and I've never seen any of them risk that before." Virginia nodded her head. "Interesting. I'm not going to lie, I'm very nervous about going to sleep tonight. Don't worry, Your Highness, said Nathaniel. We've got a system down just for that. What's that exactly? Night watch, said Tristan. We're all going to take turns guarding the camp and keeping a careful eye on things while the rest sleep. And on that note, said Charles, I'll take the first shift. Next, Nathaniel. Tristan, you keep the last watch. Well, you set yourself up for that one, said Tristan. Why's that? Asked Virginia. Because he's the one that has to wake up Nathaniel. Let's face it, I'm one of the few who knows how to wake him up properly, said Charles. Virginia looked at him. Properly? Without being killed? Her eyebrows shifted a questioning glance. Killed? It's not as bad as that, said Nathaniel. It's exactly as bad as that, exclaimed Tristan. I agree, said Charles. It's pretty bad, Nathaniel. I'm confused, said Virginia. What do you mean it's as bad as that? Tristan looked at her, using his hands to explain the phenomenon carefully. Nathaniel has this condition. He looked at Charles. Condition. That's the appropriate word for it, right? Yeah, I guess, replied Charles. You make it sound like I was born with it, protested Nathaniel. You two were the reason I still have this, whatever it is. This what? Asked Virginia, almost laughing. When you wake Nathaniel up in the morning, continued Tristan, he has this reflex, a lethal reflex, mind you, where, depending on how severely you stir him, he wakes up in full-on attack mode. Funny thing is that the poor guy barely remembers doing anything of the sort after he wakes up. The whole thing normally happens in under 5 seconds, and then he comes to. Virginia's lips tightened as she tried to rein in her laughter, while her eyes grew wider in bewilderment. You're saying that he wakes up and attacks the first thing that wakes him? Exactly, said Tristan. If we find ourselves in that terrible situation where we have to wake up the guy, we first remove all weapons far from him, and then carefully nudge or tap until his eyes open. Soaring Eagle knows how to do it best without being killed. Virginia looked up at him. How then? I extend one of my wings, stand as far back as I can, and gently brush his cheek with the tip of one of my feathers until he wakes, said Charles. He still wakes up with a jolt, as if a small bolt of lightning channeled through his body, but he doesn't grab anything or toss anyone or break anybody's bones and such. It's not that bad, protested Nathaniel. It is so, argued Tristan. You threw me up in a tree branch back when we were younger, and that was just one occasion. Tristan threw a pallet out on the ground a few feet away from the fire. Oh, all the times I've imagined the horrors your future wife might face. Stop that, Nathaniel pleaded. I can just see it now. You waking up one morning on your honeymoon, finding your new bride's feet dangling from the ceiling, with the rest of her lodged in the newly formed hole you threw her into. Virginia turned her head away, trying her hardest not to reveal the laughter surfacing on her face. Stop it, Nathaniel protested. That's not going to happen. Besides, if it's as bad as all that, it's only because of you two. There's no evidence that can 100% prove that, argued Tristan. You and Charles attacked me in my sleep back when we were kids. Ever since that day, after that very day, I've had these so-called problems. Virginia turned her head back and looked at Charles and Tristan. You attacked him in his sleep. Yes, they did, said Nathaniel firmly, and my morning routine has never been the same. Oh, you can't expect to pin all of this on us, said Tristan. Can he, Virginia? I mean, come on. He can't say that this is all our fault, can he? Virginia glanced back and forth between Charles and Tristan again and shrugged. Sounds like you guys messed him up. Thank you, exclaimed Nathaniel. All right, just for that, Virginia, you're waking him up, teased Tristan. Virginia laughed. If it's as bad as you say, I'm never waking that man up. Okay then, Charles. We shall depend on you and your gracious touch to wake up the grizzly, said Tristan. Nathaniel unrolled his mat in the air, slapping its end against Tristan. Hey, shouted Tristan. Call me a grizzly, huh? Replied Nathaniel playfully. Take it as a compliment. What else could take down a grizzly? Nathaniel thought on that for a moment and then smiled. Yeah, I like that. Or what could survive after waking one up? Nathaniel tossed a pine cone at Tristan. Stop it. The first one was better. Virginia smiled at the three of them. You all seem to be really close friends. Oh yeah, laughed Nathaniel. We grew up together and somehow haven't killed each other yet. That's because we know how to wake you up now, joked Tristan. Drop it, snapped Nathaniel. Virginia wrapped her arms around herself. Do you guys view me as a friend? All of them turned their heads toward her. Charles smiled. Why wouldn't we? I do, said Tristan. With all due respect, Your Highness, said Nathaniel, you're just as crazy as us. Why shouldn't we call you friend? Virginia smiled big. Then could you all do me a favor? Sure, said Tristan. Could you no longer call me Your Highness and call me Virginia? Like how Soaring Eagle does, it makes me feel less like a stranger and more like a friend. A welcoming smile crossed their faces. I'll do just that, said Nathaniel. Welcome to the team, Virginia, said Tristan. Virginia looked at Charles. He gave her a little wink. Thank you, she said. Tristan threw his hood over his head. I think I'm going to turn in early tonight. With only 5 or 6 hours of sleep tonight, I want to make sure I can catch as many of them as I can. Nathaniel grabbed a blanket from the rickshaw. Me too. Virginia looked around. Do I have a blanket? You've got the rickshaw, said Charles. She turned around and looked up at him. There is an extra blanket stuffed in the back corner, he continued. Nathaniel will be sleeping at the front of its entrance. Any bad guy trying to get you will have to stumble over him first, and we now know what happens when you do that. So watch out where you step at night. A little smile crossed Virginia's face. Where will you be? I'll be in the woods, more than likely up in the trees, looking down on everything in the night. Virginia smiled. Like a guardian angel, huh? Charles smirked. I'm not an angel. You know that. Yeah, I know, she smiled. But like a guardian angel, watching over me in the night. Charles smiled at her. Yeah, like a guardian angel assigned to someone special. Charles took a step back. Closing his eyes, he began to sing in another language that sounded beautiful and calming. 2 massive wings unfolded from his back. He opened his glowing eyes and looked at Virginia one last time for the evening. Rest well, he said. With a big clap of his wings, he shot up into the evening sky. Virginia watched as he soared to the tallest heights of the canopy, landed on a branch, and stood guard over her. She smiled at him, watching his wings glow in the twilight evening amidst the swaying branches. She turned around and saw Nathaniel and Tristan looking like children trying to hide their laughter. Quit staring at me. Good night? I spy with my little eyes, began Tristan. Virginia's eyes shot open. What? Shut up. Nathaniel raised his hands. I'm not going to say a word. Good, said Virginia, because there's nothing to say. Of course, assured Nathaniel. Of course. That old smirk crossed Tristan's face. Something beginning with Virginia rolled her eyes and climbed into the rickshaw. Good night, you two. Good night, Virginia, said Tristan. Welcome to the gang. Deep in the darkness of the woods sat 2 pairs of green eyes focused intently on the campsite ahead of them. One pair of eyes looked up and down between the rickshaw and the glowing star nestled in the tree branches above. My prince dark cry, spoke one. Do we attack while they sleep? No, replied Dark Cry. They are on high alert right now. Even as they sleep? Even as they sleep. He looked up into the treetops again at the bright wings glowing amidst the branches. They are more than alert now. What do we do then, my prince? Darkcry looked down at the rickshaw. Let them sleep for now. Tomorrow they will be faced with another power, one far greater than you or me. Before the sun rises tomorrow, Cohen will be no more.
This is the end of Chapter 16. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 17. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.